Oh, hello, everybody. Funny he would mention that I have a painting degree. I hate painting. I haven't painted anything since college. It's just not what I was into. But I went to college in the 70s and I wanted to have a liberal arts degree. And I originally wanted to be an archaeologist. And then I switched over to liberal arts and I started taking core classes in many different fields as I possibly could. And I didn't declare a major until my very last quarter in school, which was 6 years. And I had the most credits in art and painting. So I ended up with a painting degree. But what I was trying to do is give myself a liberal arts degree, which back then they didn't offer. For some reason, they'd gotten rid of it. And also on top of that, I wanted to be a graphic designer. And at that point, the graphic design was taught in the art department, which makes no sense when you get down to it. Well, I'll explain that later. And it was in a 2-story building, and the top floor was the art department, and the bottom floor was VICOED, Visual Communication Education. And that's where they taught you how to use cameras and TV cameras and typesetting machines and printing presses. And they hated each other. The art department called the VICOED people a bunch of prostitutes, and the VICOED people called all the people in the art department a bunch of snobs. And so they didn't talk to each other. And if I had declared a major in either department, I would have been banned from the other department. And I wanted to have a graphic design education. So I was taking classes in both departments, and nobody would talk to me because they all thought I was either a prostitute or a snob, depending on what they associated me with. And that was one of the reasons why I couldn't really declare a major until my very last quarter in school. I ended up with a painting degree. So the fact that you actually found that is I think it's the first time I've ever been introduced as a painting major. But anyway, hi, I'm a graphic designer. No confusion there. Graphic design, to kind of elaborate on what he was saying, is I really look at graphic design as language. It's a visual language that goes back to the very dawn of time, the very dawn of man. When we use the words and letters and just words themselves, you get down to it, are graphic design. They're little black and white squiggles that we have associated with objects and things that we all agree upon as having that meaning, and they're put together sounds. When I use yellow, I'm saying something. If I use a circle instead of a square, I'm saying something. We all know what a circle means. We all know what a square means. You can't really define it. A circle is female. A square is male. Why? We just all assume that. We all know what red means. We all know what a ratty, dirty line versus a very clean one-point line looks like. A squared corner versus something that's been Xeroxed too many times. These things all have meanings, and when you start getting into actual illustration and working with all these things, you're more like composing stories. But they're not your stories, because we are involved in a language of culture, and we all live in a capitalist culture, and the people who pay me to speak this language on their behalf are businessmen, and they're trying to sell something. It could be a product, it could be a concert, it could be a political candidate. These people are the ones that hire me to do this language. And this predates fine art. Cave paintings were graphic design. They weren't fine art. They weren't following their muse. They were actually functional images that were actually disposed of. Cave paintings were spirit animals. They literally attacked them with, there's arrow marks and spear marks on the paintings themselves. And then after that, the spirit of that animal was dead. They'd go out and harvest it. Everything was right in the universe. And then that drawing was just ignored, forgotten. Whenever you see paintings of herds on cave walls, they aren't herds. We hadn't invented perspective yet. Perspective wasn't invented really until, even the Egyptians didn't quite have that foreground perspective worked out yet. what they were doing was painting over, they were basically putting a new beer can and putting it on top of an old beer can that was laying there in the garbage. So, I mean, basically, our language, graphic design language, is like the language, the visual language of our shared culture. And it goes across all languages and stuff. The fact that they teach graphic design in an art department, I think, is just ridiculous. And this is after having grown up with that system. I think teaching, usually when I used to teach too, I've taught at several schools, Cornish, universities, mostly at night schools to working professionals who want to bone up on their skills. And they, excuse me, I'm old now, so I'm going to do some brain farting. I forgot what I was going to say. Never mind. Sorry about that one. But anyway, so what I'm going to show you here, I have 3 boxes of, these are my old slideshows. When I go around and give lectures, I would show these boxes of slides. I really haven't done much of this since COVID. It really kind of died. So this is like one of the first lectures I've done in a while. So that's one of the reasons I'm kind of floundering a little here. But back in the old days, I had to go to lectures and bring slides, 35 millimeter slides of my work, because that was how you showed people. And after a while, as it got kind of antique, I had to bring a slide projector with me too. So I'd go through security with these boxes of slides and a slide projector, and they'd always stop because they thought it was a bomb or something. It was just crazy. Always having to explain to a TSA guy what a slide projector was weird. And eventually I just transferred them over to digital. And this is the actual box. Everywhere I went, they'd have a visitor sticker, and I just threw it on the box. So I have like 3 or 4 boxes like this of different collections of slides that are just covered with stickers from all over the world. But this is what my work looks like. When I'm talking about pop culture, I'm talking about the culture of all of us. This is the kind. At one point in my career, I'm an alcoholic, and I needed to stop drinking. Back in the 80s, I was dying. It was really awful. And I had to make a pact with myself. Well, part of the reason that I was drinking so heavily was simply because I was miserable at what I did. I was trying to make a living as a corporate graphic designer. I did work for Boeing, Safeco, Nordstrom department stores, banks, things like that. And, at the same time, I was kind of in this underground punk rock culture that was burgeoning at that point. So the dichotomy was just insane, and it was just more than I could handle. I ended up in the hospital. I was working myself to death, just trying to make a buck, because Seattle was a very competitive market. And I finally made a pact with myself that I would no longer work with assholes just because I wanted their money. And I thought that was going to be professional suicide. It was a freelance scene up in Seattle. They didn't really you couldn't really get a job doing graphic design strictly in Seattle, because they had this enormous freelance market that drove the price way down, and there was incredible talent. So the result was that you were struggling from paycheck to paycheck as a freelancer, and that's what the market was like. So this is what I was entering into. So I thought my career was over. And the funny thing started to happen. I started to really enjoy my work a lot more when I did that. I ended up working for people who were more like me. They were artists. They had creative backgrounds. They were struggling. They were just starting out. And they were also people of my culture, of my underground culture. A lot of theater people, a lot of poet people, a lot of punk rock people. These were the people that I actually interacted with, so we could speak on a more direct level. And then what happened is they started winning design awards for this stuff. And then on top of that, I started to get all these new clients coming and knocking on my door from all over the place that had seen my work. And the funniest thing of all is, like, I was getting so much work that I was making more money doing these little crappy jobs, posters for a punk rock band that breaks up after their record comes out, than I was working for the corporate guys, because the punk rock guys were honest. If you didn't pay them word got around and nobody would work with you. Whereas in the corporate guys, they have entire divisions of lawyers and bookkeepers whose job it is not pay their bills. And that was a real hard lesson to finally learn. So when I stepped away from the hard corporate business world and just decided to live the life I wanted to live in order to stay sober, this is what happened. Sad, isn't it? I got to do all these posters, like I said, for bands that were like the bands I actually liked. One of the things I wanted to do with my life was I wanted to be an archaeologist. And obviously it was reflected in this interest in popular culture, language, and graphic design. One of the things I've always tried to do is learn the visual language of subcultural groups. Different areas of subculture have different languages. I mean, for instance, this is like a collage made out of about 100 different old ads that I found in a newspaper. And I clipped them all out and glued them all together and kept all this stuff. I mean, this was like a huge paste up, And I worked by hand. I would actually glue things onto paper. I'd cut overlays. I'd work full size, because we could process that kind of thing back then. That's how it was done. And when you do that kind of work, you're learning how to talk to a printing press. And I got really good at this. I could do anything with a printing press. It didn't matter if it was a crummy press or a high-end press or silk screen or letterpress or potato stamps, I could do amazing stuff with that because I was so used to working at this gut bucket level. I didn't rely on the technology and money that usually goes along with it in order to get things accomplished like you do today. This was my very first punk rock poster. This is from about 78. And what I tried to do was de-teach myself of everything I knew about graphic design and look at punk rock and decide, how do they do this? How do they actually think? How are they creating this stuff? Obviously, these guys were so poor, they didn't have any money at all, so they couldn't afford things like buying press type to rub down stuff. Of course, nobody had computers back then. These guys didn't even have telephones. The way they communicated was on telephone pole posters so that they kind of glued together themselves on their kitchen tables and stuff, and that's how it was done. And this was where this entire community found out about where their clubhouse was going to be where the next meeting was going to be. This is where my people are. And they'd go and show up. And the way you spoke to them was by creating images like this. When this poster went up around the town I was living in, within 24 hours, every single copy had been torn off the walls and thrown on the ground. This offended an entire city to the point where they would attack it. This is what the world was like back then. It was a totally different space. You guys don't quite understand what it's like unless you're really old, like us. I think what actually offended them was the picture of Saturn devouring his child that was painted by Goya that I snuck up there. That I think is what freaked everybody out. But I'm not quite sure because I wasn't one of these people. I was really upset. My wonderful little poster all done by hand, trying to think like a punk rocker. And people attacked it and tore it and threw it in garbage. And it was like, why? And then I realized it's because they got angry. They saw it and they got pissed off. They looked at it. They responded to it. And I manipulated that. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but that's what happened. Aha, a tool. And that is how I retaught myself how to do graphic design, trial and error. I was trying to use the language of the different groups to speak to the people they were trying to reach. Comic book jokes. Let me see. Right. This is a silkscreen poster, just two colors, black and red, on a piece of white paper, about 18 by 24. That's not the Munsters. They just kind of look like the Munsters. Old ads, pictures, old photographs in ancient magazines, type that's been reproduced way too many times. printed on newsprint. This is printed on a piece of newspaper. This was like wheat pasted around Seattle. And because when you use wheat paste and newsprint, you can't get it off. And these posters were hanging around Seattle for years until finally the rain and the weather rotted them, literally rotted them off the walls. You could do stuff like that. It became part of the environment of people actually walking everywhere. This is a silkscreen poster where I took, you ever gone to like Home Depot to buy and looked at wallpaper samples? They have these big books and you open it up and there's all these pages of all the latest wallpaper designs that you can buy to put in your kid's bedroom or your kitchen or whatever. But wallpaper is also subject to fad and design changes and taste changes. So periodically these things kind of stop selling, and with the old books, what they do is they throw them out. So I would be standing next to that dumpster and I'd pull them out and I'd cut the pages out and then I'd print posters on them. So what would happen is every poster was the same, but everyone was different. I mean, one of the nice things about silkscreen is you can print on garbage. And believe me, I've printed on garbage just to see what it would look like. This is a farmer's market doing Victorian language. This is long before Mac OS. This was a street skate punk gang's logo called the Generic Skate Team. This is like Lawrence Welk humor. It's for a drag show. This is a cabaret of performance art. Instead of like having cabaret singers and dancers and performance in the coffee shop or whatever, they had performance artists. And I remember going to this and seeing Jesse Bernstein, this poet, recite poetry with a live mouse in his mouth. That was the evening's entertainment. This is the people I hung out with. I did a lot of theater posters. Again, using the same kinds of ideas. One of the interesting things about theater posters is that they have to exist as editorial statements describing the performance and hung on the street for people to look at and decide they want to go to based on no knowledge whatsoever of what the play is about. So how do you do that? How do you tell people you want to go see this play and give it ideas of what the theme and production is like, even what the period it's set in, on a graphic image that's going to be a 3-second attention span as somebody walks or drives by it? These are kind of the techniques you end up having to come up with. This is just a 2-color print job, silk screened again. The guys who silk screen these things for me it was an outfit that I would hire silk screeners. I wouldn't silk screen myself after a while because it's like, it's hard work and it's messy. But and I just wanted to design stuff. So I hired an outfit that only printed for sale signs and political campaign yard signs. That's all they printed. And they were so bored that they loved the idea of printing theater posters, and they did it in exchange for tickets, which they give their clients to go see as a little benefit, bonus thing. And so we got all these silkscreen posters for basically some tickets to a play nobody wanted to see. And this is the kind of stuff we were doing. One of their specialties was taking Shakespeare and putting it into an inappropriate era. And like I did a poster for Macbeth set in the era of the cattle barons. This one is Midsummer Night's Dream set in the 1950s. And it was literally this is Happy Days version of what the 1950s was. So I tried to make it look like a neon sign from a drive-in theater. This was a play by Cocteau. No, it's by Cocteau. And so in order to make it authentic, I went and scrounged bits and pieces of Cocteau's actual drawings that were like in his autographs that he would sign, and some books and stuff. And basically collaged together my own Cocteau drawing and then signed his name to it. This is when I told you I was trying to do corporate work. This is what I'm talking about. This is a sales brochure for Safeco insurance companies. I could do really beautiful stuff. I was so good at this stuff that other graphic designers would hire me to do their corporate annual reports and things. Basically, they would tell me what to do, and then I would make it so, because I could do it a hell of a lot better than they could. And I got enough money to pay rent, and that's how I was surviving at this point. Then I got involved with this little newspaper. It was a newsprint magazine that came out once a month, and it was covering probably punk rock or youth culture. All the people in it were of that culture, and it was basically a very, very upscale zine. And it started in the late 70s, and it lasted for 20 years. And they went through an amazing collection of famous people that started, when they weren't famous, they worked for the Rocket. People like Linda Berry, people like Matt Groening of The Simpsons was working at the Rocket. We had people that later became famous rock stars working there. Sub Pop Records began as a column in the Rocket, a record review column in the Rocket. So I mean, it's like was one of those primal starting points of communication. Again, it was the only kiosk in the entire region that covered this information. So if you wanted to know what was happening in your little world, you picked up the Rocket once a month. So this is what we were doing. This is a photographer named Karen Moskowitz. She ended up going on to do TV guide covers. A lot of people who worked at the Rocket, like in the design and photography and illustration world, went on to really huge careers. A lot of them became art directors of crappy little magazines like Time and Newsweek and Vanity Fair and Metropolis, and what are some of the other magazines? Village Voice, people like that. They became art directors at major international magazines, but they started off pasting up these things at the Rocket. And believe me, it was a gut bucket thing. That our ceilings leaked. We had to move the tables depending on where the leaks were happening. We pasted up everything by hand. It was a place where you could learn and make mistakes, and you could screw it up entirely, and it was perfectly okay. And that was one of the greatest learning places, because you're also working on a killer deadline. The magazine had to come out. So you ended up like making decisions by the seat of your pants. So you got really good, and you trusted your instincts after a while. It was a great training ground for just working at this stuff. Oh, by the way, that's Tad. Karen Moskowitz was really great at doing set pieces. You'll see a couple more of her things show up. And what I want to point out, where's my little laser pointer? I got a laser pointer right here. See if we got. Here it is. This little piece of type right here. See that? It's a peace symbol. This is when the Gulf War started in the early 90s. And we were just, everybody who worked at the Rocket were, lefties and stuff, lunatics. And so we had to make some kind of comment, political statement. So I did all the headline type in the shape of a peace sign. That's the subtleties we went for. And some of the people I knew and worked with, I mean, when the grunge thing hit in Seattle, it's like the whole world's attention went suddenly to this little podunk town of Seattle. I mean, Seattle even now has a population of under 1.5 million. The Seattle city limits only has about 500,000 people in it. It's a small town. It's a big city for that entire quadrant of the U.S., but it's a small town. And when something like that happens, people flood into the city. And all of a sudden, you walk into a bar and there's Joan Jett sitting next to you or something like that. Just sooner or later, everybody who is one of my friends we had scooter clubs and stuff in Seattle. One of my friends who had taken a scooter and tarred and feathered it, basically with chicken feathers, so it was a chicken feather scooter. Anyway, he had it parked in front of a restaurant, and this big limousine tried to park over, didn't see it, and actually ran over his scooter and crushed it. And so he comes running out and says, "Hey, you ran over my scooter." And the woman inside the limousine comes out and she apologizes profusely and offers to pay for it. And it's Demi Moore. That's the kind of incident you'd have in Seattle at that point. It was just ridiculous. This is the Jim Rose Circus Sideshow. They were friends of mine. One of the things for instance, right there, you can't see it very well, but that right there is a dart stuck in his chest. This guy, sword swallower, this guy with a fire breather and a pin cushion. This guy was a guy who had piercings all over his body, and he would lift heavy things with them. He'd have a chain, he'd hook it to a cement block, and he'd lift his arm, and his flesh would stretch, and he'd lift it up. And then the finale of his performance would be behind a backlit screen, a sheet, and he'd lift things with his private parts. And it was scary. It was just, these are the people I hung out with. It was really fascinating. They all had great stories. But you can see I was always experimenting with typography. My secret weapon in my design work is always my typography. If you really look at my design and don't look at the pictures in the design, the illustrations, the photography, the wacko colors, my design work is actually very traditional. I look at a good grid design as being a clothes rack. It holds everything together, and you can hang the wildest, frilliest dresses on that clothes rack, and it looks fine. Walk into any clothing store and you'll see what I mean. And that was kind of my approach to these covers. Was I always tried to make it, nail the design down so it was just hard edge as possible, and then throw in a wild photograph. One thing, let me back this up here. Another thing about the Rocket was it was a magazine, right? In magazine covers, the name of the magazine is always at the top. Why is that? Because magazines are sold on racks where they cover the actual front of up and all they expose is the little headline. So it becomes a necessity. Well, the Rocket was never distributed on a rack. It was basically delivered as a bundle of papers on the floor of a record store, a hip coffee shop, a boutique, and the band was ripped open, and they basically would just smear over the floor, and that's how you found your copies, latest issue of the Rocket. So you never really saw just the top part like on a newsstand. You'd always see the entire cover, and always in strange angles. So I started to take the idea of moving the masthead around. It's just something you didn't do. In fact, it took me a couple of years to finally talk the editors into letting me do it. Even they couldn't quite deal with the idea of taking the name of the magazine and putting it at the bottom. It took me years of convincing. And this was about the time I quit the Rocket. I was art director at the Rocket 4 times. We went through art directors like you guys go through socks. I mean, it was just burnout. I kind of held the record with 4 stints. I quit 3 times and was fired once. Not in that order, by the way. So anyway, what we were trying to do here is I was just trying to start, these are the last few issues of the Rocket I did. So basically, this is my kiss off goodbye to working at the Rocket. I started to sink the masthead. I started to zip it around, and it ended up on the bottom upside down. But it continued all the way around and ended up, this is the last issue I did, it went back at the top. I made the masthead do a complete 360 on the cover. I don't think anybody noticed. This is what the individual page layouts look like. Again, you can see what I was talking about. This is hard-ass typography. But look at the photo. Do you really even notice the typography? This is one of those little tricks that I was doing with crap. One of the things working at the Rocket was it was such crappy printing. We used the cheapest printers we could find. And these were the guys who printed those old advertising newspaper flyers that you used to see distributed in little stands. A lot of these guys printed like porn. This is like that level of crap. So that one of the things a lot of the fine printing techniques that I had learned through the corporate world, where everything had to be pristine and perfect, couldn't do that stuff because they couldn't even hold registration. I mean, one of the things you notice is that the blacks aren't black, they're gray. And the paper's not white, it's gray, kind of a brown gray. So you're not really printing black and white, you're printing gray on gray. So how do you work with that? Well, you take advantage of what you can do. You print ink right over the top of all of it, so it goes over the black and the white, and it discolors everything because it's such crappy printing, and you can read the headline right over it. So basically, we were trying to figure out ways of pushing garbage to the point where it became a whole new art form. Like I said, Sub Pop Records began as a record review column in the Rocket. Bruce Pavitt wrote, and I was, art director off and on. I had to lay out his pages and stuff like that. And he was just part of the community. And he and Jonathan Poneman, who started Sub Pop Records, they both worked at the Rocket. They wrote for the Rocket. They hung out there, and they were like our friends. And when they started their little record company, this was their third attempt at starting a record company. All of them had failed. Everybody helped them out. All the designers at the Sub Pop over the years were ex-Rocket art directors and designers that had worked there for nothing. And so we had developed a style kind of based around my thinking at the Rocket that became kind of a look that reflected what was going on in the punk rock community in Seattle. And so when Sub Pop Records started, these designers carried those ideas over into their record cover designs and the thinking and a lot of the in-your-face kind of approach to what was going on. This was a 45 I did for Horton Heat that was released on Sub Pop. This is an example of the kind of thinking I brought to the. Basically, you'll notice the name of the band isn't on the cover. The name of the record isn't on the cover. The only things on there is this big stupid battery that says love. And of course, I always put the Sub Pop logo on the front cover, like a good housekeeping seal of approval, And so here's the only actual type on this entire thing is that Sub Pop logo in the corner. Talk about annoying. The name of the band is Love Battery. Duh. Illustrated by one of the guys who lived in the house with them, a famous illustrator now named Ed Fotheringham. He lived in a house with guys from Love Battery and Mudhoney and Soundgarden. This is how tight a community it was. They all lived in the same punk houses. And the name of the record is Dayglow. And of course, that's like a bright Dayglow pink ink. It's a 2-color print job. Slam, easy, cheap. Really cheap to print. This was also about the time that CDs were replacing vinyl, early 90s, late 80s. And right off the bat, CDs were little, vinyl covers are big, so we all hated printing little CD covers. The other thing is that CD covers were always slid into this cheap piece of plastic that always cracks and gets scuffed. So you're always looking at our beautiful artwork through this scuffed up piece of broken plastic, And you print them on these little booklets that people will take it out once, look at it, put it back in, and never look at it again. It's very different than reading a record cover while you're stoned listening to the music. That is what we grew up doing. All of a sudden, CDs were covers, CD jewel boxes, they were called, were just disposable garbage. So I was kind of protesting the whole idea of a jewel case. I had just done some projects that we used guns to shoot full of holes. So I was kind of fascinated by that idea of actually trying to figure out a way to shoot a CD with a gun and actually still have it work and playable. Couldn't pull it off, of course, but the name of the band is Pigeon Head. I don't know if you can see it very well, but that's a pile of garbage. And that pile of garbage, is like a burned out trailer. In eastern Washington state, where I'm from, Washington state's like two states. There's the western half, which is where all of Microsoft and all the rainforests and the mountains and the outdoor living and all the happy lefties are living there. And then there's a mountain range that cuts it in half. And the other half is high desert country with sagebrush, rattlesnakes, and cowboys, And it's like, in Washington state, everything is 50-50. The election last night was nothing new to us. It is like cut in half, and it's like these warring sides that won't even talk to each other. And everything is one end or the other. So in eastern Washington is also where they had Hanford, which is where they first made plutonium for the Manhattan Project to build the nuclear bombs in the World War II. So back then they weren't so good at taking care of radioactive materials. And what they did is they just dug holes and dumped it all on the ground. And of course, 40, 50 years later, it's leaching into the rivers or catching radioactive salmon. They don't like to talk about that sort of thing. They have no idea how to clean this stuff up. It's there. And there are there's an entire region of Western Washington that's called the Hanford Reach. And that's where the Hanford facility was. and it's all radioactive, and they've got it all fenced off, and you can't go in there. It's basically became a wildlife refuge over there, and it's a weird wildlife refuge because they find things growing over there that don't grow anywhere else in the world. Like for instance, there's a little plant, a little flowering plant that's a ground cover, has these little purple flowers, and the only place it grows in the entire world is in this radioactive area, and it grows in a patch that is 10 feet wide, 1 mile long. I have no idea what it is. They find radioactive animals starting with radioactive ants. They have problems with radioactive ants coming into the cities. Radioactive sagebrush rolls in. Birds, rabbits, work your way up. Coyotes. They've actually found radioactive moose living over in there. Anyway, so if you got a place like that and you're a cowboy over in Eastern Washington, yeehawing it up and stuff like that, and you want to get drunk, go out and shoot your gun, what do? Well, you basically, go find a pile of garbage and you shoot it. I mean, I've done that. Haven't you? Well, I guess you're not from up there. Okay. So if you want to find garbage dumped, well, you go to the Hanford Reach where everybody just dumps their garbage. And that's what this is. It's a pile of garbage that somebody dumped in the radioactive part of Washington State. And so, and shot up with their guns, So a friend of mine photographed that, and I put it on the record cover. And then in the very middle of that TV screen right there, you can see the little hole right about there. We drilled a hole through the cover. So it goes through the entire booklet, and you can see, here's the back of the booklet, here's the photograph, and the hole in his elbow is kind of a heroin joke. This is about the time heroin hit the Northwest in a big way. A word about high fidelity, you pop a hole right there. The hole goes right through the entire thing. So that's what the kind of humor we were using. Here's a larger photograph of a larger print. This is the promo poster. I printed the Sub Pop logo backwards because this was actually a kind of a dance record, which is the antithesis of the music they were putting out. The logo has drop D tuning humor in it. That's a joke for the musicians because that's one of the keys of the ingredients of the sound. But you can see this, here's that hole again. The way we did that hole was we went to the printer. One of the things you got to learn about printers, the old school printers, is a lot of them are gearheads. Basically, an awful lot of outlaw bikers became printers, work in print shops. They all love the machines. They're really into that stuff. So every print shop I've ever worked at had a few bikers working back there. So what we did is after we printed all the posters, the owner of the print shop and I went back and said, show us your guns. Everybody pulled out their pieces and held them up. We just picked the biggest gun. And we went out in the parking lot with forklifts, set the whole stack on a pallet board. And the owner of the shop said he had to do it for insurance purposes. He wouldn't let me do it. He stood on top of the stack of posters, which was probably about a foot tall, and shot it once. Right there. And it went through the entire stack of posters, through the pallet board, and into the pavement. And that's what we call bindery up in Seattle. Took an old record cover and made my own with some duct tape. Why not? Something was wrong with this photograph. They complained about it. I don't know what their problem is. 2-color print job. One of the things I learned working with a rocket, you could take 2 totally divergent colors and print them on top of each other and end up with a third divergent color. So this was basically a Dayglow peach color printed over green ink on a white piece of cardboard against an LP cover. By the way, Pussy Galore was a big band in the 90s. One of the things that's real interesting about them, I think, is their logo. And this type also was done the same way. That logo was actually created by a guy named Nate Cato, who was in a band called Urge Overkill back then. And he was an artist that did a lot of construction stuff. That piece of type was actually cut out of a sheet of metal with a blowtorch and then photographed and then Xeroxed to create that. It was really just done for a street flyer. But the band, who was friends with the guy who did it, wanted to piss him off and use that piece of artwork as a logo without his permission, just to insult him. And it ended up becoming their logo. And so basically this type up here, I had to have done with a cutting torch on a piece of metal as well, just to keep it uniform, you know, graphic standards and all. Cookie, the type there you might notice, that's the, you ever go to a grocery store and they have in the birthday section, the baking section, they have birthday candles and stuff, and they have these little things that are little sugar candy alphabets that you can write Happy Birthday Susie on your birthday cake. That's what that lettering is. I glued it to the photograph or the drawing. I do stuff that looks like graphic design too. I mean, it's kind of like modernist, isn't it? I like the inside better. Basically, if you can't design in black and white, you can't design. Color's a luxury. We could never, back in those days, extra color cost money. That's why you see so many 2-color print shops, because 3 and 4 was too expensive. We couldn't afford it. So we ended up doing everything in a couple of colors and figured out ways to push it to the limit. But usually you didn't have color to work with. So you just had to figure out ways to make the black and white work exquisitely. I'm sorry to show you this. This is really offensive, I know. I'll just leave it up there for a while, make sure you see it well. The Thrown Ups was a band. A lot of people say they were the ones who invented grunge. In Seattle, consisted of members of other famous bands. And they never practiced, they never wrote songs. They would get really fucking drunk and then go up on stage at the break, grab the other band's equipment, specifically choosing instruments they did not know how to play, and they would make up a song on the spot. And it was just worked. These guys, you know, these guys were so talented and so fucked up that it worked. And Ed Fotheringham was the singer. He became a very famous illustrator. You've probably seen his style and don't know it. He would get just plowed and stand up in front of the microphone and just make up these ridiculous songs. Just like, it's something that very few people can actually do, but he would just come out with this stuff and it just, you know, spit. And he'd also dress up in crazy costumes. For instance, he came up on stage one day and he was wearing a jumpsuit and he had all these plastic babies full of whipped cream. And what he did is he handed out soda straws to people in the audience, and you could pop the thing and squeeze it and squirt the whipped cream out. And he called it his zit suit. This is what life was like in Seattle, man. It was like anything goes. This little thing in a CD jewel box, you know, that little gripper thing that holds the CD, in the business, that's called a nipple. So that's why I did this. Oh, that's just offensive. I'm sorry to show you that. I hope it doesn't offend anybody. Okay. Now, you know, here's another, this was a top secret record we really couldn't show you, so we had these files built. You know, this looks really expensive, but it was really cheap. We just found a printer who was willing to do it, you know. They don't want to mess with this stuff. If you can't just throw it on the press and walk away from it, most printers won't even take your job. So, I mean, we found printers who are willing to have fun because they get bored out of their skulls, you know. This is an actual photograph of the presidents of the United States of America. That was a rock band. It is kind of a pop rock band that came out of Seattle in the early mid-90s. And I was hired to do the cover. This was my initial idea. They actually opened for Bill Clinton when he was running for office, and he came through Seattle and did a stump speech. And in their wisdom, they hired the President of the United States of America to open up for Bill Clinton. So they had their photograph. This is the President of the United States of America at that time. But you know, this was my cover design. They wouldn't. The record company that put it back basically chickened out on this idea because he's afraid Bill Clinton would sue him. I told him he wouldn't do it. He'd probably send you a thank you letter. But so when they released it in America, it had a different photo on the cover. But this is the version that was released in Europe. This is actually an issue from Spain. I mean, I love stuff like this. You know, you're just tying everything back in on itself till it trips over its own feet. See, most records have white covers with black vinyl. So I did the opposite, just to be a smartass. Also, the band were real purists. There was this punk purist thing that happened in the early 90s. And it was also kind of a woke thing. What you ended up with is all these little stupid bands. I was so well known for doing all these, dangerous, fucked up images that they gave me a list of what they did not want to see on their record cover. No naked ladies, no exploding hot rods, and no drug references, no this, no that, no this, no that. When it was all done, there was nothing you could put on the cover. So what I did is I put nothing on the cover and just put their name. And the back of the thing was completely black. And the inside of the LP cover was printed with black ink, so it was black inside, but there was this white record. And of course, I put a photograph of the band on the label. That's the only place they showed up on their record cover. And of course, the guy who was the most strident about not having this, not having that, and everything, I made sure his face was right where the hole was drilled so there's like a big hole where his face is. Never piss off a graphic designer. We always get the last word. The name of the record is Spittle by a band called Burt. Yeah, okay. Here's the back. A French band. Everybody knows the French can't rock. A lot of people accuse me of misogyny with this cover, but no, it's another bullet hole in a TV screen. Remember that. This one's actually sideways. I'm really fascinated by monster magazines, Monster Type. There was a magazine when I was a kid, I actually subscribed to it, called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And they had an art director named Harry Chester. Harry Chester was a hell of an interesting art director, very modest, never promoted himself, died in obscurity. He designed things like Mad Magazine. He designed a lot of movie posters, a lot of that monsters movie posters from the 1950s that had all that great monster type, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Thing from 10,000 Fathoms, things like that. That was Harry Chester's lettering. In Famous Monsters of Filmland had the most spectacular hand-rendered monster type in it. And all of it was done by hand by Harry Chester. And again, he was one of those guys that his layouts were just nailed down. Everything was a total grid pattern. Bang, 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 bang. No nonsense. Slam it in there. And then he'd have this big, juicy, dripping, bleeding monster type trying to eat you, filling an entire page. It was just like spectacular. I spent years trying to track down Harry Chester. I wanted to talk to this guy because he was such a huge influence on my thinking. I finally got a phone number for him. He didn't have any kind of computer or internet contact. He was too old. When I finally worked up the nerve to call, he had died a year earlier. It took me 2 or 3 years to work up the nerve to call him, and I missed it. But I talked to his wife, his widow, and all she wanted to talk about is how much they love to play golf, But it's like one of the neat things about doing what I do is I'm constantly researching popular designers who are obscure. I've gone out and found people that, when I contact them and said, "Are you so-and-so? You're the one who did that," they will start crying. Really, you're the first person who's asked me about that in 40 years, I've ended up hiring a lot of these people to work. Some of them have actually helped revive their careers. I've ended up working with people like Von Dutch and Ed Big Daddy Roth and Stanley Mouse and Milton Glaser and Nathan Gluck. You don't know who most of these people are, but they're the ones who actually started things like Monster Type. Now this thing's sitting on the side, but you can see the typography. That's like pure Harry Chester Monster Type as imitated by me. It still doesn't quite look as good as Harry's. This was a band called the Cheater Slicks. First time I saw this band, it was in a crowded nightclub tavern, a rock tavern. Everybody was having a great time. And they started to play. And by the time they were done with their first song, the entire bar had emptied out. They'd all gone out on the sidewalk, except for me and one of my friends who ran a small record label, who immediately signed them on the spot. If they can clear out a room, I want them on my record label. And they were called the Cheater Slicks, you know, and here's a photograph. I tried to come up with the worst color combination I could think of, you know, puke green and bright purple. I love that guy's face. They were so hungover during that shoot, man. They were just barely standing, you know. And then, of course, you know, the name of the record, what do you do, you know? Go for a label maker. I collect label makers. All those little plastic guns that you have the adhesive type. One of the interesting things about those label makers is that there was all these different manufacturers, because apparently it wasn't copyrighted or something. And every single one of those manufacturers had different guns. Every one of them had different typefaces on them. I've got a collection at home. What I do is I pick them up either at a junk store for $0.25, take them home, load some tape in them, check them out, compare to my others. I've got about 15 different typefaces, and there's still more out there I know exist that I haven't found yet. So basically, I create my own sets of typography using pop culture cast-offs. Harry Chester's Monster Type, label makers, you know, Xerox machine. I've designed entire typefaces based on Xeroxing an existing typeface too many times, generation after generation after generation. I've actually sold typefaces to like places like Chart Pack, the old press rub down lettering companies. One of the things I tried to hustle was selling it to that. It didn't really pay very well, so I stopped doing it. But there are still typefaces out there that you can buy. Of course, you have to buy them as part of a package online, and it costs you hundreds of dollars. But back then, you used to be able to buy it for about $5, and you could rub it down yourself. It still shows up around Halloween a lot, and also on a lot of record covers for Dead Moon for some reason. You know, that's an ashtray from a restaurant that was in my building, and the name of the band was, Sugar Shack. The name of the record was 5 Weeks Ahead of My Time, and somehow this band had been around a long time. They were kind of exhausted and burned out, and, you know, thus the title. And that was just the appropriate image to use. I was real proud of that. It was one of my cigarette butts in it. The Crown Royals had a MacArthur Genius Award person in the band. I mean, these guys were dumb, but they were not stupid. These guys had MacArthur Awards, Genius Awards, you know. The name of the record was Funky Doo, and they were kind of a soul band mixed through garage rock and jazz. And originally I had a different design, but I finally found this photograph of all these wig heads. You ever seen wig stores where they just have all these mannequin heads and there's all these, and that's one of those photos. If you can't think of anything else to do with a design, if you're ever really stumped, one of these days I want to do a book of, you know, design solutions that everybody's done and tried at least once in their life. Use an arrow. You know, you got nothing going. You cannot figure out what to do. Use an arrow because you can point at things, you know? Here's one of my bad print job jokes. It's on glossy paper stock. It's cardboard. It's a record cover. And what's going on there is that I printed the image, the photograph, in black gloss ink. And then that stripe going across the top was Dayglow orange. And where it went over the black, it beat it up and became kind of a dirty orange color. And where it went over the white type, it came out as screaming fluorescent. So it was a way of pushing two totally inappropriate colors on one cover that was really cheaply done to really grab impact. I did a lot of record covers for bands that didn't know how to play their instruments. This is a Japanese garage rock band that I swear to God could not tune their guitars, but they were extremely popular in Japan, largely because noise was very popular. So I had an old pickup truck, and in the back of my pickup truck, I had an old gas can for emergencies. So that's the gas can I owned. I Xeroxed it on the Xerox machine and used it for the cover. That's just offensive, but I like it. This is one of those projects. We had to destroy an entire city to get this photo. An enormous amount of work. This is a surf band. They played surf instrumental music. They were really intense. They were really great musicians, and they were really intense and purist about their music. They call themselves the Galaxy Trio. And the name of the record was, let me see if I can read it here. Saucers Over Vegas. That was the name of their record. So what I did is I found a photograph of the old dunes and I put a flying saucer in it. You know, on the back I had some surfing flying saucers. That one up there, that one's wiping out. Here's the inside. Whenever I think of Vegas, I think of nuclear bomb tests and flying saucers, Area 51. Again, here's an example of how to use an arrow properly. Whenever you find, I really love flying saucer photographs. I think they're the most amazing things. They're just endlessly hilarious, endlessly interesting. But one of the things I really love about particularly old flying saucer photos is they always have an arrow pointing at it, like in case you miss it. You know, you don't want you to miss it. And that's one of those nuclear bomb tests outside of Las Vegas city limits. Back in the 50s when they were doing the tests out there, they would literally have buses that you could pay $25 and go out to the test site, a busload of tourists, and watch the bomb go off. You know, viewing distance. Of course, that's also within radioactive distance. You kind of wonder how many cases of cancer were caused by that. There was a famous movie that was made where it was a Howard Hawks film starring John Wayne. And they actually took the cast and photographed them in trenches near an actual nuclear bomb test and filmed it. It's in the movie. And everybody in that cast, including John Wayne, died of cancer within 20 years. They don't talk about those things. Here's another photograph of the Galaxy Trio, Life Begins. And I put some flying saucers. This is a band called The Pills. So one of the things I did at Estrus, because nobody had ever done before, is I made round 45 covers. This is a 45 single, and it literally is a round cover. I figured out how to make one, little flaps, glue it together, and this band is called The Pills. So I used this watercolor paper that was really chalky stuff, printed the name across the middle like a Bear aspirin, and that's a tint varnish. You guys don't know what varnish is. I feel sorry for you. And it also has a slightly blue drop shadow thrown in there. And that's the disc inside. Well, here's the back side. So the idea was all it has is the name of Estrus, and you can break it in half if you only want to listen to half the record. Of course, all the information on the label is your FDA information on sustainability and stuff. And on the other side, we wanted to make sure that it wasn't child resistant. That's how far we go with this stuff. These look expensive, but they were done really cheap. We were really good at finding people who were cheap and were interested and wanted to have some fun. So we ended up finding, it's like the white vinyl. You know, back then, colored vinyl was really hard and expensive. I mean, you couldn't find anybody who would even do it. And if you did, it just cost an enormous amount of money. So what we did is we figured out, all right, who was pressing a big major label? Okay, Pearl Jam is being pressed at Sunrise Pressing Plant. Okay, what color is their specialty vinyl? Red? Okay, cool. When you're done pressing the Pearl Jam record, you're going to have some red vinyl left over. You can press our 45 in there because we're only doing a couple thousand. And we get the color for free. Of course, we had to like schedule ourselves and be disciplined, but that's the kind of trip we were doing, you know? That's Sunny. Sunny is kind of like one of the main people in this particular scene. She ran zines and record labels and things like that. She really was an extraordinary person. So she wanted to be a devil girl on a Mono Men cover. Of course, we had to make a calendar out of her as well. This is Sunny again. She's on the cover of this Mono Men. This is a live LP. there's a bachelor party held at a bowling alley in Illinois called Savage Lanes. And they had bands and free beer and burgers and and it was a drunken blow. They had strippers, yeah, lots of strippers, and so the whole thing was like this drunken blowout. This is like one of the drunkest performances I have ever heard set to vinyl. It's just like, and it's great, but it's just chaos. So what we did is we wanted to make it look like an old men's magazine from the 50s. Again, this is not an Adam cover. It's a Modern Man kind of rip-off idea. But what we did is we got Sunny and dressed her up like a bowling pin, and then we printed the bowling pins on the front. It's supposed to look like one of those magazines. And I don't know if you can see it, but you can see right there that drop shadow. It has a die cut on the cover. Basically, we cut around the bowling pins so that they could fold up like little doors. We figured out a way to get that done for really cheap, simply because we used our techniques. So when you open up the doors, there's Sunny doing a striptease. And you can take the center thing out and put it back in the other way, and you have Sunny demonstrating proper bowling technique as well. So it's educational. This was a promo item that we made for that record release. On every one of these records, one of the things I did at Estes is on every project we did, I designed a new corporate logo. I think they had 300 corporate logos. And I wasn't the only one. There's a half dozen other designers, some of them really famous, designing logos for them. Every time you did a record cover, you designed a new logo. And some of them are just stupid, and some of them are really cool. And it's just like this incredible array. We think, basically our attitude towards logos is that we think they're really fucking stupid. Why do people everybody's got to have a fucking logo? Every coffee cart on every street corner in Seattle has an award-winning logo designed by a famous graphic designer. Why? I saw this one designer who won a design award for a logo he designed for his dog, and he had it hanging from his collar and won a design award for. This is overkill. I mean, trademarks, okay. Usually a trademark is a logo type, so there's a word there. But when you have just some blasted logo with some shape and it's supposed to, drives me crazy. It's just bad design. Anyway, so we're back to the Naked Chicks. This is actually a water transfer decal. You ever seen old Winnebagos that have all these like travel decals on it, Yellowstone, Place of Mystery, Devil's Island? Those are a printing technique where you silkscreen on this certain kind of paper and then varnish it. And what you do is you take the thing, you soak it in water, and the piece of plastic floats off. And then you take that and lay it against your surface that you're laying, and you let it dry, and it stays forever. I mean, those logos you're looking at on some of those Winnebagos have been there for 50, 60 years, and they still look brand new. So we decided we want to have, as a promo item, some travel stickers made for this record, the Strip and Bowl tour, that use water transfer decals. Turns out they stopped making them in the mid-60s, maybe even the late 50s. Nobody in the world made them anymore. The only place we found was in Singapore, and they were a print shop that would do anything you wanted, but they charged you a lot for it. So that wasn't an option. So we did a little research, figured out how they were made, talked to a silk screener who did a lot of t-shirt work in Seattle. He goes, yeah, I can do that. So he basically printed actual water transfer decals, and we ended up, giving them out on the tour, and you still see them on people's hot rods, What was really interesting is that other people in this scene saw these water transfer decals that we've done, and they go, where did you find those? Who makes them? So we gave them this contact, and all of a sudden this t-shirt shop no longer printed t-shirts for a living. They printed water transfer decals. And it revived an industry. And this guy basically spent the next 25 years of his life printing water transfer decals for model shops and hot rod shops and speed centers, and all the coupe decals are printed by him. And so, when you're screwing around with this stuff, like I said, it's language. People still see this stuff and they read it, and it creates response. And in this response, you can manipulate that response. Sure, people went to the tour and stuff like that, but that thing still exists after the event is over. then what is it? Well, it's an artifact, a cultural artifact. I'm in the business of creating cultural artifacts. Somebody once said that what we do is create landfill. Basically, all the stuff that I create as an artist ends up in a landfill because it's all packaging and advertising and crap like that. But not all of it. And some of it survives and becomes an influence later down the road. And that is when it becomes my art. My name's on that. That's me talking 100 years from now to somebody who's looking at it and have no idea who the Mono Men were or what Strupenbohl meant, anything. But they're going to look at this thing and go, wow, how'd they do that? That's cool. That's kind of interesting. And my art background led me to try this technique. Basically, what I do now with my work is I'm speaking in this language to the culture, and very effectively. You know, this is I've been able to like be very influential with this stuff, so I know I'm on the right track. But it always has a corporate logo for some client on it. Well, sooner or later, that thing's still going to be out there. That logo is going to be useless because the client went out of business 100 years ago, and that thing's still floating out there with my name on it, and it's still interesting. It's still speaking, and that's when it becomes my art form. That's what I do. I try to design stuff that's still interesting 100 years from now. Here's another round 45. This was a single released off the Tom Strupenbohl record. It's a bowling ball. I don't know if you can make it out very well, but we actually had some hot foil done there. So we used the same logo as the bowling ball company, altered a little bit, of course, and used a picture of an actual bowling ball and printed it on there. So, I mean, it's like, again, we're taking these ideas to ridiculous extremes. At this point, the Mono Men, this was their last record. They were in a really bad mood by this point. We're so pissed off at everybody. So we did a record cover for the name of the record is Have a Nice Day, Motherfucker. And this is it. I thought I'd just leave it there for your entertainment. Here's the promo poster for that record. Again, I hate CD packages. CD jewel boxes just suck. One of the things that happens with CD packages, you open them up and they're instantly boring. You know, there's maybe a song list, and over here is the record label's corporate information and stuff like that. One of the things we tried to do at this record label was keep it interesting as you go. And so the inside of this CD, when you open it up, it was reel-to-reel tape, master tapes for the actual record, done on vintage master tape, which is the way they recorded it. So the one on the right side is the CD disc itself, and the other one's just a printed image. Here's another joke from that same project. These guys were also into vintage equipment. They used antique guitars. They used antique microphones. One of the types, they used antique speakers, amplifiers and speakers. And there was this brand in the 60s called Orange amplifiers. They were like the loudest. The other one was Marshall amps, which are still around. They've started making Orange because of this weird revival. But what the guys in this scene started doing was like finding these old ancient Orange amps. And these things were like nuclear bomb proof. These things they were bright orange vinyl, and they were built like you could spill an entire pitcher of beer on them and they wouldn't short out. And that was very desirable because a lot of beer flew at these concerts. And they were also heavy as hell. I mean, they basically didn't put handles on the side, and they were built like real furniture. And so it took 4 guys to lift them up and take them out to the truck. They were so heavy. And they didn't put handles, so it wasn't easy to lift them up like they do on most things. Orange amps became the amplifier of choice for these garage rock bands because they were fucking loud. I saw these bands crack windows with volume. I mean, it was just extraordinary, the stuff I saw these guys, a lot of these bands do, because they were just pushing limits all over the place, but from this other direction. You know, they were literally trying to like kill people or something. I don't know what it was. Anyway, one of the things that was cool about Orange amplifiers is that the little knobs on the front, They had, all the volumes, treble, bass, on, off, things like that. And on most speaker cabinets, it says, or like on the front of a stereo, it tells you what each knob is for. This one's volume, this one's bass. But on Orange amplifiers, they just had a little logo, And so what I did is I recreated the look and logo of the Orange logo, but changed it to say Monomen. And then I put the actual little logo. That fist is the volume control. Volume was a fist. These things were like the amps of all the early heavy metal bands. I mean, guys like the MC5 and Black Sabbath and Alice Cooper. And I mean, it's just all these really heavy duty, nasty bands from around 1970 or so. They were all using amps. They were Orange amps. And some of these bands, I saw a lot of them live when they first toured because I'm old. And, I lost a lot of hearing, and it was due to these amplifiers. Again, speaking to the collective audience that I was designing these things to speak to. Oh, on the back, in case you couldn't figure out what the little fist meaning amplifiers, I put a knob that went to 11. Does anybody even get that joke anymore? Thank you for laughing. Here's a record that's a compilation by the Monomen that was released only in Europe. But a lot of these things, these bands tried to release on as many, they wanted to support their community. So a lot of these bands weren't signed to a specific record label. They would try to release as many records as they could on different little tiny labels so that everybody could make some money and they'd all have a market to play on. A band like the Monomen might have records released on, 24 different labels all over the world. I mean, there's records by this band that were only released in places like Brazil or in Sweden, and that's just the way these guys all work. So I ended up being able to design these things that popped up in other places of the world and create a little bit of havoc over there. Back in the 1950s, we had something called, I don't know if you guys still have this stuff, it was called pornography. And generally what you got in the 50s were like these men's magazines that if you look at, maybe would have a bare breast once in a while, but basically everything else was covered up. A lot of skin, a lot of curves, and an occasional nipple, but the rest of it was just pretty tame stuff. And that was considered pornography. That was my father's pornography. You guys have a lot better stuff. But anyway, one of the popular forms of pornography back then were dirty novels, dirty books. These were like cheap novels. They were printed by basically mob connections all out of Las Vegas. They would literally, there are stories of them literally taking writers at gunpoint and making them sit down and write a book in front of them, and then they would take the script and run and publish it. And a lot of really famous writers made a few bucks doing that stuff. People like Hemingway and Jack Kerouac kind of, they did this stuff because they needed to make a living like anybody else. It's really interesting when you get to know these people. Like I've gotten to know an awfully lot of really famous designers. You'd be surprised how many of them started in the porn business. I mean, you'd be shocked. Some of the biggest names in the business start off in porn, They started off doing all these weird things because that's what was available to them to do work for, Once they got to a certain level, they jumped ship and went to hire more sophisticated, more tasteful clientele. But that stuff's still out there. Well, one of the things that was funny about, I used to collect these novels because they were hilarious. To begin with, they're always just beat to shit. I mean, they are just, they're torn up and, falling apart and wrinkled, and they've gone through a lot of hands. And one of the things that happens in dirty novels like this is, to begin with, you open them up and you read them and you look for sexy parts. And to begin with, there really isn't anything dirty or sexy in them. It gets up right to the point where the action's going to happen, and suddenly they cut to two people smoking cigarettes in bed. And it's all inference. It's hilarious pornography because it's just not dirty, And it's no more dirty than a TV show you'd watch on a Thursday evening on a major label, on a major station. It's silly. And if you go through the text, you look for dirty words, and they're not even there. I mean, a word like pink or pajama was the dirty word, It's really hilarious. Lip, So what I did here is, this was a record called Bent Pages. One of the things that happens in those novels is there's page corners that are bent over. And those are where the dirty parts are. People have tagged them so you don't need to read the whole book. You can go straight to the dirty parts and read them. So the name of the record was Bent Pages, and I made a dirty book cover out of it. And those are actual pages from porn novels from the 1950s. If you look closely, you might be able to make out a word, powdered. Oh, I see the word breast. Oh, lingered, pink-lipped, sensuous. Yeah, that's porn. that was my father's era, right? And of course, it wraps around to the back. That's just like one of my favorite pieces I've ever done. I just think that one is just sacco. I don't know how much time I'm allotted here. I could go on for a day or two, allowed to, but how are we doing on time right now?
We're an hour, almost an hour.
Really? I've talked that much? I'm sorry, folks.
We probably have like 10 more minutes before they have to look back.
Okay. I have the next reel I have kind of shows my personal history. I mean, there's even student work in there. You guys interested in seeing what I was doing when I was your age and trying to figure out, which was up and which was down? I'll go through them real fast. I won't spend a half an hour talking about each one. Now, let's see. I got to do this. And I got to do this. I got to do this. I want to do that one. Yeah, that's the one. And then I got to do this twice. Sorry about this, but I still don't use computers in my work. Okay, I do this stuff, believe it or not, still by hand. I'm online a lot. I figured out how to do things like Facebook, but I don't like this stuff. This is just not what I'm interested in. This is not that physical, emotional. Okay. Yeah, here's box number 2. You might recognize Shepard Fairey's thing. He stuck that on my box. Shepard Fairey's, I don't know, you guys even know who Shepard Fairey is anymore? Anyway, I did this in 1976. I was a student in college, and it's a play poster for a performance of Play It Again, Sam, as a stage play. And the only printing I had available was the student print shop. So I had, for $35 and a case of beer, I could buy beer, they couldn't. I would have them print 50 to 75 copies on this paper that was like blotter paper. I mean, they had to hit the black twice to make it look black. I had no access to things like photostat cameras or typesetting. The way I did this thing was I tore out pieces of black paper and glued it down to create a Humphrey Bogart joke. And then all the lettering in there, I got literally some old type books, like Dover type books, and I Xeroxed pages of alphabets and cut them out one by one and glued them down with a glue stick. That's how I did my type. That was probably the best education I ever had with typography, because all of a sudden, when you're working that closely with type by hand on that scale, you have to learn about things like letter spacing, word spacing. You understand the personalities of typefaces. Typefaces in the old days, not so much now, were designed for specific purposes. They had specific functions. Typefaces were designed specifically for printing on book pages. Others were designed specifically for movie titles. Other typefaces were designed specifically for package design. I mean, all of these things were done for a purpose. Nowadays, we just make things look cool, like gig posters, rock posters. Back in the old days, it had to have some meaning. Theater posters have to have meaning, or it's unusable. Gig posters just have to look cool. A lot of my gig posters that you've seen here were started off as projects for other project magazine covers or illustrations, or rejected by that client, so it just went into a drawer. And a few years later, somebody says, "Well, I need a poster for a concert on Tuesday. Can you do it overnight?" I go, "Yeah, sure." I would pull out one that looks interesting and cool, change the type, and it's ready to go. It doesn't mean anything. It just has to look cool. Play posters have to actually reflect a theme and an idea. And all these typefaces I was using, I was learning how they work together, how to letter space them, how to create line spacing, punctuation, all the proper caps and all that kind of stuff, and their personalities. Every typeface has a personality. And you don't use a prissy typeface on a punk rock poster unless you want the contradiction. Sometimes the juxtaposition of the opposites works better than anything. One of the things they try to tell you in modernism is you always make things look of a type, of a sort. And what I found is that stuff just blends. It just becomes part of the noise out there. If you take things that are totally the opposite, a really rough, gooey, organic image against some really hard-ass, crisp type, and you put them side by side, they both scream. But if you take an organic, gooey image, and you put it against a really gooey, organic script face, you put it against each other, they just cancel each other out. You can't see either one of them. Those little ideas are just the opposite of like interior design, architectural design. I mean, these ideas are basically about clashing as a tool, ugly as a tool. Pretty, anybody can do friggin' pretty, Try to use ugly and make it work the way you want it to work. That's where you start to have to think. Here's another one. This was done, as you might notice, the type was all done with a typewriter. All I had was a typewriter and a Xerox machine that cost $0.25 a shot. That mouse trap, those are pictures cut out of magazines stuck in an actual mouse trap that I found inside of my apartment, my student apartment, inside the wall, and hanging on a string. They're trying to catch the mouse. It's probably been there for 50, 60 years. Pulled it out, stuck these images I clipped out, and then I literally glued a Swiss cheese to the artwork. And I was so ignorant, I took it to the printer, and he looked at me and goes, "What am I supposed to do with this?" I said, "Shoot it." So he stuck it on his stat camera and shot it. It turned out like this, total ignorance, and it worked beautifully. This was a student poster I did. This is probably about 1978, 77. No, it was 77 or 6. That was for a student art contest, and I was taking an etching class that had, we had stone litho, which was kind of cool to work with, but there was also intaglio. And so we had a press in the print shop that everybody was using, and I was really interested in embossing. I was taking things and I'd take handfuls of coins and throw them on the press and then print them. So every one was different, but they were all the same coins, They'd always be arranged in a different way. I was trying chance ideas like that. And so what I did is they wanted me to design a poster for the student art contest. So what I did is I took my favorite pair of cutoffs, because it was spring, student art contest in the springtime. And back then we wore cutoffs. You guys all wore those little cargo panty things and all that shit, Back then we just wore our jeans until they rotted. And then when they just got to the point where they didn't have legs left, you just tore them off. And then you continued to wear them until they rotted even more. We had pairs of cutoffs that you could see cheeks through them and stuff like that. The pockets hung farther down on your leg than the pants did. Zippers blowing and all that stuff, And you wouldn't wear underwear. That wasn't cool, And that is the way. This is in the 70s. This was a different world from you guys. You guys have it easy. You can actually buy little fancy shorts. We had to make our own. That was my favorite pair of cutoffs. I'd had that for over 10 years, and they were blown. And I finally said, okay, I'm going to donate them to the cause. So I cut it out. You can plainly see the zipper, the button and the belt loop and all that. Here's the torn edge, and that's actually the pocket, the little watch pocket thing, top edge of the waist and all that. First, I coated the entire zinc plate with plastic through a laminator. Then I cut out using stencils, student and contest, soaked it in the acid until it was really deep etch. Then I took the pair of jeans and I glued it to the actual plate. And then I cut out the letters art in cardboard and glued it on top of the jeans. I ran it through and everything came out completely blank except for the type. And it's because the cutoffs were so soft, it didn't make an impression. So what I did is I took a can of marine spar varnish I had found in the garage and I varnished the entire thing. So it was hard as a rock. And then I ran it through. And this was the poster, actual poster as it was hung around. It was an embossed poster. One of the interesting things was that zipper cut through 2 sheets of padding and scored the drum and ruined the drum. They wouldn't let me touch the machine after that, but I got my poster out of it. This is the first place I ever used Label Maker as a design tool. This is about 1977 again. This is another student art contest for about a year later. At this point, I was working in a non-print graphic design visual place. Basically, I was doing Leroy lettering for a lettering levy, and you guys, I'm not going to get into that. And they were always throwing shit away, and all those little images were an advert for clip art books that you could order different clip arts that were copyright free that you could use in your advertising and layouts and stuff. And these were in a garbage can, and I pulled them out and I go, they're kind of cool. I'm going to do something with them. And I ended up like printing. Some of them had been cut out and some of them not. And what I did is I ended up printing the layout, which was identical on each page, but with different images on top of each other in primary colors. This cost a little bit more because it was 4 colors. The image in the middle is a guy lifting an anvil with his teeth. I clipped it out of a Charles Atlas ad in an old comic book. And some people thought he was puking on an anvil, and that's cool too, you know. And then I did all the lettering with a Label Maker. And this was the first time I used that stuff. At that point, even punk rockers didn't use that stuff yet. So, and the whole thing was printed, and that's the way it turned out. And this was like one of my first big excursions. Delete this file, cancel. Okay, there we are. How about it? I did it. This is my first business card. I think it's printed in '76. Fine graphic design. Note the registration problems. When I moved to Seattle, I wanted to do posters and nobody would hire me. I mean, I couldn't get arrested in Seattle. I came roaring down there thinking I'd be a famous designer and doors slammed in my face. I was going to 5, 6 interviews a day for weeks and months, even years on end. Never the slightest nibble. So I ended up having to become a freelancer like everybody else and just hustling clients. And I went to the local music promoters and talked them into letting me do posters for them. I think I got paid $35 to do this poster for a Gang of 4 concert in Seattle about 1980, 81. Started off as a Russian postage stamp that I found that was about this big, this teeny weeny little postage stamp. And I blew it up and redrew it, and added all the type and changed the expression on her face and all that stuff. And it became like one of the first punk rock posters in Seattle that really got a lot of attention. I mean, it became a hit. And the band took it back to England with them and used it in their tours in Europe. Didn't bother to tell me about it. You know, Romeo Void. One of the things that happened was I was collecting old punk posters off of telephone poles because they were just so amazing. At the time, I was studying Dada and early surrealism and that era, the early futurists and things, and I was really fascinated by that stuff. And I was really trying to think like these people. And then I walked down the street one day in Seattle. No, it was in Bellingham, Washington, like Roanoke, Virginia. Anyway, I walked down the street and all of a sudden there was this thing on a telephone poster that looked like a Dadaist nightmare. I mean, back then, all graphic design in the 70s was all like rainbows and unicorns and earth tones and nature and hippy dippy hangovers and you know, and that's what design looked like. A lot of calligraphy, you know, big gooey calligraphy, you know, craft. And then there was this poster that looked like somebody had scribbled it on the wall and soaked it in acid and just let it melt and then hung it up. And it was a punk rock poster. I'd never seen anything like it. I was flabbergasted. I actually took it and hung it on the wall of my apartment and stared at it for weeks until I finally began. It turned out it was designed by a guy named Franco, who became one of my all-time favorite punk poster artists. Very obscure guy. But anyway, these collections, in 1984, I approached a publisher and I said, let's do a book of all these cool punk posters. And she took one look and she said, yes. And so I actually wrote this book called Instant Litter, Concert Posters from Seattle Punk Culture. And it was published. And, you know, they went through about 10,000 copies. You know, I don't think I got any royalty checks. It was all money went back into the printing. And this thing actually ended up, the one bookstore in America that sold the most copies was the Museum of Modern Art bookstore in New York. They sold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies of this book. And so that turned out to be my stepping stone into, all of a sudden, the Museum of Modern Art in New York knew my name, not as a designer, but as a writer, which is hilarious because, you know, I was virtually neither at this point. About 20 years later, they gave me a one-man career retrospective show at the Museum of Modern Art. You know, these little weird things make connections for you. You have no idea where this stuff's going to end up. Again, I want my posters to be interesting 100 years from now. This book got me into the Museum of Modern Art. It was also incredibly, my show was incredibly well reviewed. It was given a full-page review with 2 or 3 reproductions in the New York Times. You know, it's just like, cool, meant nothing, changed absolutely nothing in my life, but it happened. And as a result, my work's in places like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's actually hung in the Louvre. You know, it's in the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress. You know, it's crazy where this stuff has ended up, but it's all through connections. Basically, as a hustling freelancer, you hustled and you got your stuff out there. Just the fact that I sent a bunch of posters to this guy here ended up kind of cementing the fact that I'm here talking to you today. You know, he's a collector and he's in a position, you know. That's how this stuff works. Going to a job interview is not how this stuff works. If you really want to do this stuff and do the fun stuff, the good stuff, you got to go out there and hustle. You got to become a salesman. You got to put effort. You got to work hard in it. I tried to get a job in Seattle for about 30 years before I finally gave up. Nobody would hire me. I survived totally off freelance. Oftentimes doing these little punk posters for $50 a pop. And you had all that. In Seattle, rent was really expensive even back then, so you had to do a lot of work in order to make rent. You know? Here's another one. This one got a lot of attention. But again, that was just a publicity photo of Tina Turner. This is back when she first left Ike and went solo. And what I did is I Xeroxed the hell out of it, printed it with red ink on yellow paper, then a big heavy black border. And then at this point, I was drawing the type I wanted. If I couldn't find a typeface that had the right feel to it, I would just sit down with a T-square, a couple of triangles, maybe a couple circle templates and things, and draw my own type. Try it. You might be good at it. I didn't know I was good at it, but I was. And it was from the very get-go. You don't know if you can do it or not. Get yourself some pens with ink, you know? Get yourself some templates in a T-square and just write your own name. Have fun with it. It may take you in an entirely different direction in your life. I did a lot of tall, skinny posters for various colleges. Andy Kaufman came to town. So tall, skinny posters were because they did all their posting on lampposts and telephone poles. It became a very practical shape. So when you see tall, skinny posters in my portfolio, it's because I was doing them early when all my posters ended up on telephone poles. This is a 2-color print job, green and red when you overlap and turn nearly black. That's Katharine Hepburn wearing 3D glasses. This is the first piece in my entire career, 1979, where I actually could afford to hire a typesetter to set the type for me. I've been making a living as supporting myself as a graphic designer for 5 years before I'd actually being able to have professional type actually done. The type at the bottom was some stuff I drew, but you see that kind of gradation, that really crude gradation um, of the red ink. What I did there is I wanted a fade, and I didn't know how to do that, so I went out and bought a little tiny can of black spray paint, and I did a couple of quick fades and Xeroxed it, and then cut out what I needed and glued that into the mechanical, and that's how I did that. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention. Another tall, skinny one, that's Katharine Hepburn. I was interested in Katharine Hepburn at the time. That's like silver ink with day-glow pink palm trees on her dress. Here's a picture of Marilyn Monroe looking her very worst. The original caption on it said, Marilyn Monroe took pills to wake up, pills go to sleep. And they said, we can't have that. And they said, well, let's change it to died young, stayed pretty. They, oh, we can't have the word death on a spring cinema movie poster. So it ended up being said, it's something else. It's a complete waste. But these film posters I did for the students at the University of Washington, they had nothing before that. They had these little Xerox things they hung up, the student film series. And I started doing posters for these posters for free, $100, and their sales increased like 600% in like a month. Because people saw them, people took them home, people hung them up in their dorm rooms or apartments, and they could see what the schedule were for the movies that the students filmed. And it got to be so successful that the local theater owners in the Seattle area passed a law in the state that before the University of Washington could show any films on their student film festivals shows, they had to have them okayed by local theater owners. And the local theater owners would just basically cross everything off the list. So they went out of business because they were too successful. We're capitalists. I was doing a lot of theater posters. Again, this was printed on an AB Nick 360 in the basement of the Parks Department by a guy who was a drunk. I used to pay him in bottles of Jack Daniels, This time I was really into a Tibor Kalman, M & Company, so that's why the N's are upside down. See, you can see right there, I was creating a grid for the Bathhouse Theater. It's, a future, it was Helvetica. I mean, it was the whole thing, big, nasty grid. And each poster I did after that kind of used that same as an identifying feature. We had a lot of small theater in Seattle, so you can find entire walls full of posters. So I had to figure out how to compete. Still have it look identifiable as the theater company, so you can see it and go, oh, that's a Bathhouse poster. But at the same time, every play, the imagery was so dramatically different, you didn't know exactly what the thing was. You needed to be able to differentiate and identify at the same time. And at the same time, actually create an image that would draw them in when they knew nothing about it. This is Macbeth. This is Macbeth set in the era of the Old West and the cattle barons. That's actually a photo of my grandfather. That's a blood stain. I started doing record companies for a hole-in-the-wall record company in Seattle called First American Records. They were a tax dodge. They basically got people who had tapes. They didn't ask questions where they got them, and they put them out on vinyl records. Back to all there was, and they would sell them in bargain bins for $1.98, and they would lose money. And they'd write the money off the investors who own the rights to the tape, and they'd act as a tax shelter. It became a pyramid scheme, and they were designing records, they were creating records that wouldn't sell, if you can imagine that, as a way to protect people's investments as a business loss. And once in a while, they had a record that actually sold well, and that really screwed things up because all of a sudden they had to figure out how to bury this income. The guy who ran this label was the guy who put out the original version of Louie Louie. He had on his wall in his office nothing except this little plaque with the gold record 45 for Louie Louie. It's hilarious. That's all he needed. That was his entire sales pitch. Some of these this is one of what I was doing. I would give these, they would give me a tape and a list of songs. Sometimes not even a tape. Sometimes, most of the times they didn't have titles. I would title these records myself. And I'd have 24 hours to knock them out, give them back. I get paid $150. And for an entire year, I supported myself only doing record covers. I was in hog heaven because all of a sudden, hey, I'm a record cover designer. Never mind, it was a tax dog garbage. Um, what happened is the FBI and the IRS and everything finally figured out what they were doing. They came in. They had literally had a raid. They came in and arrested everybody, even the secretaries. The guy who ran the record company went to prison for 6 years. Um, just ridiculous what happened. I lost all of my billings for that year. The year 1981, my income was $700 for the whole year. I'd worked my butt off that year. And this guy basically, it all disappeared in a haze. So that's what some of this stuff is. There's another one. This is a disco record of Glenn Miller tunes called American Patrol, A Salute to Glenn Miller, 1981. That was some type that I Xeroxed out of a type book, alphabets, glued them down one by one, get it just right. And then I put it on a Xerox machine, and while it was copying, you move the image. In England, that's called swishing. I used those kind of techniques to death over the years. And so I basically made a flag, dropped it in some straight color, and I thought it turned out pretty cool. This is my very, very, very first record cover. Nitty Gritty Ibsen. The guy used to be in the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, thus the title. He also had a thing for kids, as it turns out. But anyway, so that's what I was doing. I knew this about him, so I started putting the kind of joke in there. Here's Eleanor Marx was Karl Marx's daughter. She was a big suffragette, a big feminist, and also in a violent, abusive relationship and with a guy who just beat her unmercifully, and she ended up committing suicide. So she was a real interesting character and was a very beautiful woman and a great speech maker. And that's actually one of her speeches I just published, printed right over her face. That's her signature at the top for the name of the play. And then what we did is we took the entire stack of posters out into the backyard behind the print shop, and we burned the bottom edge with a blowtorch because she was a real firebrand. Get it? God, genius, I tell you. Gotta quit? Yeah. Okay, the downside to being too good at this stuff, this entire stack of poster was stolen. Somebody stole them. They disappeared. They never showed up. We had to reprint it. Anyway, any questions? Good. Okay. I guess I'm done. I've just been kicked off the stage.
Thank you, Art.
Okay.